Welcome back. You're watching The Front Row. Thank you for joining us. I'm speaking to constitutional lawyer Kamotho Iganjo. Adam Zolo, who served as vice chairperson of the BBI steering committee, as well as David Ndi, economist. We're looking at the handshake 3 years on. Where are we as a country with just about a year to the general election? Are we on the right path as far as unity is concerned? So just before we went on a break, Kamotho Iganjo responded to the question of President Uhuru Kenyatta closing ranks with ODM leader Raila Odinga, but then opening up a fresh battlefield with his deputy. David Ndi, how do you look at this? With DP Ruto and the president, the tensions continue to rise as we edge closer to the general election. This unity that we keep talking about, are we achieving it?
Let me start by making an observation about this winner-takes-all point that Kamotho was making. This is a very small issue, problem of our own making in the Constitution, that we decided that presidential candidates would not be able to run for any other office. They were not eligible to run for any other office. It is not the norm, even in presidential systems. If you are in the Senate and you run for president, you don't lose your Senate seat. So, to solve this problem, we did not need a whole BBI process and amend 14 chapters of the Constitution. To be sure, there are quite a few sort of political representation issues in the Constitution. Kamotho was in the committee of implementation, and he knows that there are quite a number of representation issues that were really a bit untidy in the Constitution, and quite a few other things. The gender rule issue, for instance, is a bit untidy. We did not need a handshake to do that. This is something which have been done by a bipartisan parliamentary committee in a process which is not politicized, not captured by one side. It actually did not need this kind of to be conflated with the problem of incumbents refusing to leave office. Now, I think the fundamental flaw of the handshake is that Raila and Uhuru personalized a national issue. The election was not just for Uhuru and Raila. The election was for voters. It was our election as Kenyans. It was those of us who are supporting NASA. We feel that it is our victory which was stolen, that it is our votes which were made not to count. As NASA technical team, including Adam Zolo, we had started formulating a roadmap of how we would resolve this issue in negotiation with Jubilee as institutions. We also had some ideas about the kind of structure, even after the handshake, and Raila Odinga and Uhuru decided to make this a personal leadership initiative or whatever it is they wrote in that paper. We had some ideas about the kind of structure that could lead to a structured negotiation process, very much along what we did in 2007. But we differed. Raila and some members of his team decided that they wanted to sort of work with government, or more or less almost inside of government. They personalized the initiative. Constitutional amendment or constitutional review, because this is a comprehensive review, was not part of the BBI task force original terms of reference. You can actually call that mission creep. And that committee was actually not constituted because of its expertise or recognition on matters constitution. We were told quite explicitly when we sought to propose the kind of more technical people we thought were needed to address the issues, that really what the principals wanted was just a group of community elders who would help them facilitate meetings with the people so that they engage the public directly. Those engagements with the public never happened. The BBI task force, which was unfit for purpose, was repurposed to write a constitutional amendment process which was not nationally owned and people had not accepted that time was due to review the Constitution so comprehensively. In the meantime, because of personalizing it, and the fact that it seemed to confer advantage to Raila, who would not commit that he would not run in 2022, which is what some of us would have preferred, so that he can be an honest broker. That was bound to make William Ruto feel that Raila had invaded his turf, understandably, and the fact that there was clear evidence of weaponization of corruption to fight him politically. Uhuru and Raila actually did provoke a premature 2022 succession battle, which is something that they had said they don't want to do. But the way they went about it actually is the one which provoked it. So I agree with Kamodo that this is irregular politics. It is not. I don't think there's much to worry about that. William Ruto is campaigning to run.
Let me quickly take you back to something you've said, that those of you in the NASA Technical Committee felt there was a different way you would have done this as opposed to the handshake. What are these ideas you talk about that you had but were rejected by ODM leader Raila Odinga when finally he decided to work with the president? What ideas were these?
The situation we were in was not particularly different from the one we were in 2007. So we had a model that we could work with. You remember in 2007, we had a Serena process, a mediation process. That process led to something called the National Accord. It was public. It was outside of government. When it was finally completed, the two political sides, they stood there with a document which was public for everyone to see. And that document was then, the National Accord was then entrenched in the Constitution through Parliament, because at the time, you did not need a referendum to entrench the Accord into the Constitution as the governance instrument. That is why we could have a Prime Minister who was not provided for in the Constitution that we had at the time. Similarly, our roadmap, we envisaged a situation where we would have a similar negotiation between NASA and Jubilee, and that negotiation would lead to an accord. What we should have in that accord would be form a transitional government, which would govern from 2018 to 2022. We would share power. At the end, it would have a limited mandate of enacting or undertaking the sort of political and electoral type reforms, governance reforms, that would deal with the problem, this systemic problem of electoral failure. And at the end of that term, Raila and Uhuru would retire. They would midwife a transition and promise the country that they would ensure we have a free and fair election, and that would become their political legacy. That was the kind of conversation we were having. Okay. Even when the handshake happened, we said this is still possible. But what I saw certainly was a preference for informal channels. Okay. A lot more informal channels.
Fair enough, fair enough.
There was an unwillingness to go into a structured process.
Okay.
They saw this brotherly thing that Uhuru and Raila were talking, they were having all sorts of back channels. We disagreed fundamentally about the BBI task force that would be gazetted and controlled by the government. Okay. And now the problems they are complaining about, the civil servants, the officials, taking control of BBI, told them that.
Okay, which brings me to my next question to Adam Zolo, and I'm sure you have a few things you would need to respond to that David Ndie has talked about, and especially with regards to that committee, how it was constituted and the blessings it had, the good tidings it's had so far. But looking at the latest sentiments from the political class, especially those from Raila Odinga's camp, accusing civil servants and especially singling out PS Karanja Kibicho of trying to interfere with this process in the entire grand plan of the Uhuru succession politics. Having worked in this particular committee, is this true? Are you seeing this happen?
Basically, you know, when you ask me, is this true? I'm not in the secretariat now, but I think what basically is happening is that after our tenure ended, we did hand over to the two principals our report, and subsequently a new secretariat was formed in which you have two politicians as co-chairs in the name of Dennis Waweru and Junet Mohammed. And then you have the executive secretariat, which is Sarah Kilemi and Janet Ongera. One would expect that under such circumstances and leading up to the referendum, if you look at the referendum of 2010 and if you look at the referendum of 2005, then one would have expect that under normal circumstances, that secretariat would have some autonomy with some facilitation from the government in terms of running the referendum, just the way the government can facilitate IEBC, which is an independent body. So that's what I think currently, at least from what I've read, is part of the problem. But let me also say that on the earlier questions that you asked both Kamotho and David Ndii, I think that what has happened is that our country is overly politicized. If you look at after the handshake occurred, then you'll realize that there was kind of a political contestation or differences from both sides of the political divide. You find that the president disagreed with his deputy on the way forward, and you also find that Prime Minister Raila Odinga also disagreed with his NASA side over how to proceed forward. So to an extent, you can say that even as the intention to build unity was being unraveled, the politicization of the process, if I can call so, did not ease out. And therefore, the problem is that through the lens of BBI, both sides of the political divide always had 2022 in mind. And to that extent, it means that as the BBI unraveled, the politics of 2022 was always on the horizon. And therefore, you find that even in support for BBI or opposition to BBI, the question of 22 is coming up in terms of what are going to be the political formations, what are going to be the political realignments, and in as much as that doesn't augur well, one has to accept that that appears to be the political reality of Kenyan politics, which BBI was meant to solve. And I think Kamotho did say something that earlier on, which I agree with, that BBI is not necessarily the panacea, it's not necessarily the silver bullet. BBI is work in progress. And if I can just use the examples of the recent by-elections, then you'll find that, for example, our security apparatus are very neutral in the electoral process. Now, that's not something that you'd be able to address, for example, in the Constitution. That's something that, for example, was identified as something that is lacking in our national ethos as a people. And if you look at the example that David Ndii gave of Donald Trump, then you'd say that even as he refused to leave office, quite apparatus that are national in nature, including the the vice president, refused to go along with him because he had a national ethos, he had an ethic that the country comes first before my political leanings or my political persuasion. So the bigger challenge in Kenya is not necessarily the laws and regulations and the constitution. It is our national orientation in terms of values and ethics and lack of enforcement of laws and standing for country as opposed to your ethnic persuasion or any other persuasion.
So what I'm getting then, even in the event, you know, this document is adopted at the ballot by Kenyans and, you know, largely accepted on a vote, and then there's a 2022 general election, and you talk about all these other things that seem to be a problem, we are not quite certain that some of the issues we're trying to cure here, and I know I've asked this, but I really want you to take us through this. Are we certain that we will not, for instance, witness electoral violence? And as we answer this, let's have Matungu in mind and Kabuchai and London just the other day. What would it take for us to get there? Adams.
You see, Akisa, part of the problem, even the way we have discussed the BBI, is that we have isolated the constitutional bill and ignored the other issues that were under legislation, the other issues that were under policy and doctrines, the other issues that were there as necessitating administrative actions of the government that doesn't even need the constitutional bill to pass. As long as we politicize everything, so that now nobody is even talking of the administrative actions, nobody is talking of the policy doctrines and frameworks, nobody is talking of legislations that have been developed to align to this constitutional bill. Everybody is just looking at only the constitutional bill, and that for me is where the problem is. That just as Uganda faced the problem of militarization of politics or politicization of the military, in Kenya we face the problem that every other issue is politicized to an extent that the mundane issues that go to the soft issues of us as a nation, of building a nation that is united, is ignored. And that, for me, is a challenge.
Kamada, let me take you back to what we've just talked about with Adam Solo and the battles and how highly political it was in Matungu and Kabuchai as well as London, and looking at the violence and the heated arguments that we are seeing. And then consequently seeing those in the Raila Odinga camp say that they smell a rat, that civil servants are likely, meddling, and they're likely to be betrayed from this handshake. Do you read that? And looking at how they are all handling each other now, the failed Kibra rally, the failed consultative meeting today, attack dogs here and there talking about we will walk out, we will go back to where 2018 was. What are you reading in all this?
I think a couple of comments. One is to start off where Adams Olo left. Part of the problem why BBI has been politicized and looked only at the constitutional issues is because government also has not been on the forefront of selling the administrative structures, which did not need the adoption of the BBI at this point. By now, I'd have expected we'll be having a report every other month saying we proposed a tax holiday for young people, it's now been implemented, we propose the following. So that is actually the failure of government to implement that which did not meet constitutional statutory changes. But I think there's an important question. There's an important question, I think, also that we must remember, is that reforming, for example, the police, the provincial administration, is going to take us a long time. And what happened in Kabuchai, Matungu, was unfortunate, because that unruliness is not just with the security forces, it's also with political actors. Despite a reformed and reforming constitution, our bad habits still exist. And so one of the things we need to recognize is that the law can take us only so far. And until we continue to change our ethos in terms of how the police treat their responsibility to the citizen and how we citizens operate with one another, where we don't bully electoral officials, we don't corrupt the voter, that is a process that the law cannot help us. My final point is that the discussion sometimes about BBI and the effect of the BBI reforms on the presidency and the power of the president forgets a very important issue. Part of the reason why we devolved power was to reduce the power of the presidency. If you look at the Jubilee season between 2013 and 2017, in fact in 2020, there's been an increased weakening of devolved government, and therefore the appetite for the top has continued to increase. For me, one of the most important changes, and I would want to believe that Jubilee and President Kenyatta have had their Damascus movement in regard to devolution, is that the allocation of more resources at the county level is also going to weaken the appetite for the top. And for as long as the appetite for the top is reduced, even the sort of violence that we have for the fight for the top is going to be reduced, because people are going to be looking more at the possibility that exists in the counties as opposed to the goodies that come from owning the national government. So one has to see this as part of a marathon to continually reduce the incentive for fighting for the top. So for me, that is one of the beauties of the BBI. Even as one recognizes it's got its own weaknesses, but on the important issues, I think it has resolved a critical issue about ensuring, and David D and I know how we have fought for more resources to the center. Is a Jubilee government going to give more money to I don't know, but the constitution is not made for 2022. At some point, Kenyans will have internalized in their heads that you must take more money to the devolved systems, and that is a reform process that you cannot do, and that will weaken the need for us to keep fighting for space at the top.
Right, I want us now to take a short commercial break. I'll have David Ndi respond to some of the things you've talked about there. But when we get back, we'll also be taking a look at some of your thoughts on this. I'm seeing a number of tweets and texts. As you contribute to this, I'll be taking a look at some of your views when we get back from the break. You're watching The Front Row. Remember, as you're tweeting at Akisa Wandera, at KTN News KE, the hashtag to use is Front Row. Let's keep the tweets coming. I'll also be posing some of the questions I've seen you ask to our panelists when we get back from the break.